I think I'm like a short order chef, which is an English term. So we're a fast food chef here. I'm trying to keep it down. I'm going to use a timer up here. But thank you both, Joost and Harry, for inviting me. This is really an amazing meeting and one I've really enjoyed over the years. And I was asked to just talk about bipolar radiofrequency ablation, which is a uniquely surgical tool, but try to show you a little bit about why I feel, after using it for about 20 years, that it comes as close as we have to really an ideal technology for atrial ablation. These are my disclosures. And actually creating conduction block in the atrium, and we've discussed it a lot over the course of our session, is really difficult. And to do it, you have to consistently create a transmural and continuous lesion, and we're often talking about long lines of block that we're trying to do, whether it's to isolate the pulmonary veins or to do the left atrial isthmus. And even tiny gaps, which our lab and others really can conduct both sinus and atrial fibrillation. So you really have to have it. We've shown, and I'll show you some data, you can have, by histology, have a device that gives you transmurality or a full line 94% of the time and still have a third of your lines not have conduction block, and that's a real problem and remains, I think, a challenge in the field, and why we see such high failure rates late, or any failure, and besides the fact that we still, I would argue, don't have a great idea of the mechanisms of AFib in the individual patient. The original surgical ablation devices were really both cheap and certainly met that, and were very good at creating transmural lesions because you just cut the atrium. Unfortunately, they were crazy invasive, and the reality is, in the world, before ablation was introduced into the surgical realm, it was estimated that the Mays procedure was done just a few hundred times worldwide, and that was really concentrated in just 3 or 4 centers, most of those cases. So it was an operation that, while very effective, the reality was it wasn't adopted, and it really wasn't until these various different ablation devices were brought into the surgical arena that I think the surgical treatment of atrial fibrillation took off, and this also opened what we've seen over the last, over today, this whole new area of doing minimally invasive ablation. Interestingly, right now we're really left with just radiofrequency and cryoablation in the surgical realm, and a lot of devices that look promising were taken off the market. And I'm hoping to show you a little bit why that is the case, but probably one of the things that we learned over the years is good ideas don't always translate into clinically effective devices. And the reality is most of these devices were released both in Europe and in the US with really no real good experimental data confirming efficacy and safety in cardiac tissue. What I'd like to leave you with after this talk is, hopefully, as both electrophysiologists and scientists and surgeons, we really have to do the underlying science. That trying to say that we're going to learn how devices work by just looking at clinical results, I think, is wrong. And I think the surgical literature certainly would be a fantastic example of that. And a lot of the devices that went on the market and actually had some promising early clinical reports were really incapable of creating transmural lesions. I'm going to show you a few that are still on the market that really aren't very good, but yet I figure if they don't work in the lab, I don't know why we're using them. But my laboratory really over the last 20 years, both funded by the National Institute of Health and by generous industry grants, we've really tested all the devices that we've been able to, in order first to understand both the sort of biophysics of the ablation and also whether they could actually create stable and long-lasting conduction block. And the problem is this is really hard, and I'll try to go through this quick, but I mean, as we all know as both electrophysiologists and surgeons, the atrial wall thickness is crazy variable. That's the first problem, ranging anywhere from less than 1 millimeter to, in pathologic states, certainly in valvular heart disease, areas like Bachman's bundle can get almost up to over 1.5 centimeters in thick. We also have to deal with fat, which is the absolute enemy of epicardial ablation. Fortunately, on the inside of the heart, you guys don't have to worry about that. But we have 2 unique things in surgical ablation, epicardial fat and the heat sink of the circulating intercavitary blood pool, which has sunk many a device over the last 2 decades, and I'll have to show you. Let's just look at wall thickness just quickly, and again, just looking at cross sections. The left atrium is both incredibly complicated in terms of its architecture and also incredibly variable in terms of its wall thickness. And I love that look through an area that's very important to all of us, is that area around the left pulmonary veins. The lateral ridge can be incredibly thick, and I think is one of the reasons that you often get reconnection to the left pulmonary veins. And also, there's a lot of things in the area like the circumflex great cardiac vein and a lot of and fat that can really make ablation in these areas, critical areas, really difficult. The right atrium is even more complicated, and I will have to say on the beating heart, the only device we've seen that even has any efficacy in the beating heart has been the bipolar clamps, and I'll go through that in a second. And then we talked a little bit about Bachman's bundle earlier today, and I thought I'd throw this slide in. I just got it. Just to show you, ablating Bachman's bundle, good luck. On epicardial, probably it's impossible. In normal hearts, it ranges in pathology studies anywhere from just under 2 millimeters to almost a centimeter. And in pathologic disease states, as I said, can get up to 1.5 centimeters. And also, as people get older, and we're all operating on old people, the atrial, both size and thickness increases dramatically. And particularly, you can see down in the posterior wall where it's an area where we're all spending some time. So it's really not surprising when you look at how this huge range in wall thickness and this incredible varied anatomy, that any device that we say is just going to deliver a set amount of energy for a set amount of time is almost unlikely, just by intuitive common sense, to ever make transmural lesions. And I think that's one of the pitfalls of both surgical and catheter ablation. The other is fat. And in order for time, took a lot of my slides on this. But basically, as we know, fat has very high resistance and is really, and this is just one study of a lot that shows with epicardial radiofrequency, it basically almost prevents any transmission of heat to the underlying atrial wall. And this is just one of many studies. We've done a few on that, and every device we have checked, and it's actually similar with even cryo. Fat is really a problem in terms of preventing penetration into the underlying atrial wall. But probably the biggest problem we have when we're doing epicardial ablation on the beating heart is the heat sink of the circulating intercavitary blood pool. And I thought I'd just share with you a little bit of the problem in some of the non-bipolar devices, and as Harry's like to say, the bi-parietal devices, which I like, but we're trying to get that to be more of a common thing. But you can see this blood circulating at 4 to 7 liters a minute at 37 degrees centigrade is really, from, if you do any biophysics modeling, would make it impossible to ever really get transmural with a heat source or with a cryo source. And that is a real challenge. Now, you can overcome that. I don't have a lot of time to talk about it, but look at this catheter. This catheter was introduced, one of the first ablation catheters introduced. It was used in thousands of patients, both in Europe and the US, with no experimental testing. Yeah, it's interesting because it was mainly used for beating heart ablation. It actually works great on the either arrested heart or with no blood flow, but they never did the science. And finally, after, I think we estimated about 7,000 patients underwent ablation with the device, we showed this in an experimental study. And you can see, at normal cardiac output, you basically, less than half the lesions are transmural. It's pretty amazing. I mean, occasionally you get it, but you can see. And then as we did this on bypass in animals, as we lowered the flow through the heart by increasing the cardiopulmonary bypass rate, you get up to actually if you went longer than the manufacturer, you'd think before you released a device, you might check a few of these things because they recommended 60 seconds, and that never really got transmural, but at 120 seconds and with no blood flow, it's a perfect device. But that's not how it was used, and it was removed from the market. As it was being used was a horrific device and really could not create a transmural line. But that's true about a lot of the devices, and the problem was many manufacturers have tried to overcome this problem, the heat sink, by trying all types of tricks. And I'll try to show you that with unidirectional devices, those tricks really don't work. So first, this is a device that's still on the market. It's now an AtriCure device, but it started as an end contact device. It's an irrigated suction-assisted RF device. So the thought is, well, maybe we can get transmural if we suck onto the heart and we irrigate it to probably help. And that's a reasonable thought. I mean, if you do the modeling, it shouldn't work, and actually in reality, it doesn't work. And this is just looking at a way we test devices. We look at lesion depth versus tissue thickness and then just plot it. If you had a perfect device, and I'll show you some more perfect devices, every ablation line will follow on this line of identity. If you're below the line, it means you're not transmural. But you can see this device doesn't even have a pattern of failure. It just fails all the time. No matter how long you ablate, in thin tissue it fails in thick tissue, it fails in intermediate tissue. It just is inconceivable today, and this is now in a huge clinical trial in the US, but I mean, the device, it doesn't work. I mean, I don't know what we're gonna theorize, that the way we're gonna use this to actually treat AFib, I just don't get it. Only 18% of the lesions were transmural. It was incapable of creating a line with that. Now, this is another device, which is a different idea. It's a bipolar, but still unidirectional, and just would show you can make this better. This is the work we did with a cool rail device, and it's 77% transmural. That's a huge advantage over 18%. But when we look, the problem is you're creating a line. So 77% sounds good, but by mapping, we brought the animals back at 30 days, and none of the 12 linear lesions we created had conduction block, because you just need one gap. And that's a problem. Now, Mark has convinced me, and we have a study, but I've taken it out for lack of time. But actually, if you do a second ablation in the same spot, Mark, you'll be happy to know, we just published it, it goes up to 92% transmural. So it gets better, and then I think your technique of doing it has some legitimate, but still it's a problem, and that's a reason why I think hybrid makes sense. But the only way really to get over this is to come from both sides, and that's the fantastic advantage of clamps, especially on the beating heart, is you take out the circulating blood pool. And they generally are very good with getting through fat because the energy is much more focused. And there's 2 clamps still on the market, and they just drive energy between 2 poles. And I won't really go through the science, but it's interesting, and it really creates a very really good, in terms of a heat transfer, a really good way of looking at, of creating a lesion between these 2 electrodes that are really closely approximated to the tissue. And by measuring conductance, and when you, we showed in the laboratory numerous times, and it's clinically, I'll show you on my next talk some clinical data which shows that the lesions seem to be very, very stable, and when we compare them to a pair of scissors, it's very comparable in the results. But that seems, once that conductance, or which is the inverse of resistance, so it's just saying once your resistance gets to a stable high maximum, you really have a transmural lesion. And we've checked that. This is just some histology, but we've checked this now in 5 chronic animal studies, bring them all back and doing Mason's trichrome stain, and with we've looked at now close to 1,000 histologic specimens, and interestingly, in animals, these devices are 100% transmural. We've never seen a lesion that would be a lesion that you would do for AFib ablation. If you can test it and get over in really thick tissue, like on the ventricles where they don't get transmural, but generally it creates transmural lesions in animals all the time. But you'll see, even with a device this good, clinically it didn't. We've had some issues, and I'll show you, just share this. This was the first trial, the first report of our first series of using ablation devices to recreate the maze. And interestingly, and I always checked for conduction block, and we were shocked because in animals it always worked with 1 ablation, but you can see it took me an average of about 3 applications on the right pulmonary veins and a little over 3 on the left to get exit block acutely. So that was very different. But what was the difference? Probably what we're realizing now is the original device in the human setting, human atrium are both thicker and there's a lot more epicardial fat. And that was led to the development of the present device, which is a dual electrode device to try to improve that. And I'll tell you that right now with 1 ablation, we get about 95% exit block. And this was, we'd still like it to be 100%, but you know, this device has 2 electrodes and it alternates the energy between the 2 electrodes. And again, because of the lack of time, I won't really go into this in detail, but you can see it really, by alternating, you get a much better current distribution, particularly in between the 2, and a real uniform temperature. And you get a transmural lesion that's about twice as wide as the original clamp. And this is just how it looks. And you can see both in cross section down here, I should put it, and this, you know, just looking at it, you know, you really get very nice and discrete transmural lines. And this was just an experimental study we published just showing that you were able to really have almost a 50% increase in lesion width, which may also be an important part of its advantage. The interesting thing, and that's my timer, Harry, so I'm gonna end it up right here, but the interesting thing, I just want to show you this. We brought an engineer in the lab and we just looked at, we used a device that had a algorithm, a conductance algorithm that tailored the amount of energy to what we would think is the biophysics of the tissue. What did that look like? And I'll just show you the results of this because it's not, we looked at 656 ablations in 38 patients, and you can see it doesn't matter. I mean, most, as typical surgical ablation series, about 3/4 were concomitant, so they're patients with valvular heart disease. And you can see we don't deal with, our mean left atrial diameter was 6 centimeters, so not a, you know, a lot of remodeling here, but we had, in the amount of energy that was delivered, a 30-fold variation from the least to the most, which just would go to show again that any device where you're just delivering a certain amount of energy for a certain amount of time isn't, I just think it is bound to fail and result in problems, and you're going to have to constantly go over and over, where this device at least gives you an ability to tailor the ablation. I think I'll stop here. I mean, obviously there are limitations to the bipolar clamps, and we recently have had an engineer, we've just looked at another 1,000 of these conductance curves, and we think we've identified a way to be able to tell when you're ablating over fat and to change the algorithm to really get them close to 100% effective, but I'll be able to tell you that maybe next year. But you know, there's our other devices. This is a unipolar bipolar device, which I just would leave this with you. This 94% of lesions were transmural, but when we looked at the ablation line itself, still 1/3 of them weren't transmural. So, you know, you really have a high bar. If you're creating a line that's long, especially if you're encircling the entire pulmonary veins, you just need one gap, and then, you know, you've probably created more of a arrhythmogenic substrate than anything. So it's tough, and it's tough for all of us, but I really think that these bipolar clamps really, from on a surgical side where you can use them, really have some tremendous advantages over the other devices. Thank you very much.
I think then the secret is something we have to wait for, because it's on impedance and it's on number of applications with the bipolar. So if you go bipolar and from two sides, so bi-parietal, you will definitely have permanent lesion, permanent isolations. But what you're saying is, watch the
yeah, so see, we got into a couple tips I would just give you, which I think, you know, for people who are using the clamps. You know, first of all, they're not, it's not a miracle device. I mean, it's very important that you don't bunch the tissue, that you don't have any air inside the clamp, that you really have a good application on the tissue, and that you really try to get as much of the fat out of the way as possible, because all those will fool this algorithm. You know, fat has really high resistance, and what we've noticed even with the last generation of this bipolar clamp is that every now and then it doesn't seem to get transmural lesion. It appears to be related to a lot of fat. It does better than any ablation device we've ever tested, but there is ways. Generally right now with the present generation, and I'll have to give Mark Lemaire credit for showing this, and I think I'll soon in some experimental studies be able to show that it does improve efficacy, is we put the clamp on and we ablate with a bipolar clamp in the same, without unclamping it, until we get an ablation less than, usually it's a second ablation, less than 10 seconds is what I do. And then we do 2 to 3 sets for every ablation line. And that seems to be very, very stable.
Okay.
You know, you'd love a device that was really 100% effective with one ablation, but we don't quite have it.